Thank you very much, British Pugwash, for having me back to speak. It's really tremendous that SYP is doing this series of talks at a very pressing time. It's good to see some familiar faces and also many faces I don't know, so thank you very much for joining us. I'm Sebastian, I'm the co-director of BASIC. We connect experts and officials from government to try to build trust, reduce the risk of nuclear use and advance disarmament. And we work across 6 core programs, some of which I've mentioned. We also work on UK nuclear policy and diplomacy, on gender, youth and diversity within the field, and on emerging technologies. That's my overlap with British Pugwash. If you're interested in our work, you can go to our website, basicint.org, or follow us on Twitter at basic_INT, or also on LinkedIn and Facebook. My other hat is, for the last 3.5 years, I've sat on the executive committee of British Pugwash, and I was recruited through SYP. So I'm delighted to be back, and it holds a very special place in my heart. I was asked to sort of talk about the relationships between COVID-19 and nuclear non-proliferation, and I've taken non-proliferation there broadly to think about what's sometimes called the global nuclear order, or the attempt that the policy world tries to impose order on global nuclear politics. And I thought there were several dimensions that we could talk about. So I'm going to do a brief overview of the effect on nuclear operations, the effect on multilateral regimes, and then I'm going to think a little bit about the effect on the NGO sector and organizations like BASIC and British Pugwash, on the academic sector, and then I want to leave you with a slightly happier note, because spoiler alert, the first 4 parts of my talk are going to be a little bit more pessimistic than the final one. So I'll kick off with nuclear operations. So in other words, how is the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the practice of deterrence and the maintenance of international stability? Well, it's hard to get reliable information on something like this because it's so sensitive. What we do know in the public sector, and I'll talk about the US as the case study here, is that the Department of Defense is scaling down exercises and transfers across its bases in order to try to reduce the risks of transmission. I think we can safely say that missileers in bunkers are probably winning on social distancing. But as of April the 9th, Hans Christensen, the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of the American Scientists, tweeted that all US nuclear bases except one had confirmed cases of COVID-19. So nuclear bases, military bases more broadly, are not immune from COVID-19. There's no reason why they should be. And they're having to impose quite stringent measures to try to contain the virus and so reduce the impact on operational readiness. From the sound, from what I can see, the impact on sort of ground-based and air-launched nuclear weapons has been relatively minimal. I think the more interesting question is around the impact on nuclear ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. And it was really an article that a short article I wrote at the beginning of March that sort of triggered this kind of invitation to speak. Where I questioned whether COVID-19 would force a break in the UK's Continuous-At-Sea-Deterrence. So what I mean by that is the UK has a policy of having 1 SSBN at sea at all times. And the idea is that that SSBN, no matter what the circumstances, could not be found and would be able to fire back, presumably, but also potentially preemptively. And in doing so, that preserves stability. That's the UK's contribution to stability, if you like. The article I published was very much a question rather than a finding. So I was interested because when you have a relatively small metal box filled with potential hosts for a very virulent virus under the sea for 3 months or more, it only takes it takes one patient 0 to then spread that among probably the entire crew. And so that was the basis for, I think, a reasonable question about whether, let's say, an SSBN leaves port, it finds it has a case on board. what does it then do? Does it try and ride it out and assume that because you have predominantly fit young sailors on board that you're unlikely to have one or more deaths? Or is the responsible move for the captain then to turn that submarine around and come back to port? That question is made more urgent by the fact that it was reported in the Times a day or two before I published my article that of the 4 submarines that the UK operates, actually only 2 have been operational in the last year. So where usually you would have one submarine redundant, so you'd be rotating between 3 of them, actually you're now replacing one for the other. And if, let's say, one had just come into port and was having repairs, it was being stocked up, whatever you like, and the other one had just left, the question is then, would that one that had just come in again be ready to come and take its place? And how could you be sure that the same thing wouldn't happen again in any case on that submarine? So I drew that argument from parallels in other warships, the most famous of which is the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a US aircraft carrier, where more than 1,000 of the sailors, there were 4,800 in total, contracted COVID-19. And in the end, it was forced to dock against the wishes of the local administration in Guam and offload those sailors into a quarantined area. And it took the aircraft carrier out of action for 2 months. Interestingly, you have a relatively good sample of people there in quite contained conditions. And what they found in a recent piece of research is that only one in 5 was asymptomatic, and only 60% of them developed antibodies after having been infected. So it's quite an interesting bit of research, I thought. And there's now a whole Wikipedia article entitled COVID-19 Pandemic on Naval Ships. That is mostly surface vessels like frigates and aircraft carriers. Very few submarines have been reported on. As far as I've seen, only the Netherlands and Russia have announced cases on board submarines. But then we would expect that states wouldn't immediately go public with this sort of information. So while I'm not one for conspiracy theories, I don't think it should be ruled out that there hasn't already been a situation where one or more sailors has come down with COVID-19 on a nuclear ballistic submarine, a ballistic missile submarine, and we don't know exactly what's happened after that. Some of the things that can be done are, as I said before, kind of more strict controls. There have been reports that sailors being put into 14-day isolation periods pre-departure to try and limit the contamination risk. But really, anybody who's boarding a submarine to sail it, to stock it, to repair it, or indeed the virus could be carried on contaminated food or other equipment, all of that poses a risk, and it's quite difficult to control for all of those risks. So my conclusion on sort of nuclear operations is that I don't foresee major short-term implications for nuclear strategic stability in the kind of Cold War narrow definition of strategic stability there. There may be some disruptions or modifications to operations. In the UK's case, I think there's a particular vulnerability when it comes to its submarines, given it operates a single kind of nuclear delivery platform. But I don't think any state is going to be kind of caught with their pants down in a bolt from the blue type attack that the sort that was feared in the Cold War. Where I do see longer term implications is to sort of international security over the coming years. I think in particular in the deterioration of relations between the US and China, which at the very least will harm the prospects of trilateral arms control, which is what the Trump administration has been pushing very hard. I think the wider disintegration of the United States from the inside that we've been witnessing in real time will harm the ability of the US and its allies to project a stable, liberal global nuclear order. And because of the fragmented response to COVID-19 and the propensity states have had to retreat to their own national responses, I think it's just another indicator of a loss of faith in multilateralism to solve global problems. So segueing into multilateral regimes. Much as the economy is slowing globally, there is a slowing of the disarmament and non-proliferation regime as well. And in a sense, you might say that a slow regime is getting slower. The big date in everybody's calendar this year would have been Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which operates on a 5-year cycle. So the last one is in 2015, and we would have had the next review conference for the non-proliferation treaty in April to May. So it would have just gone. Earlier in the year, that was postponed on the basis that gathering of hundreds, if not thousands of people in New York from all over the world was probably not a very good idea. That's been postponed provisionally till January, and we hope it will go forwards. And a lot of other preparatory meetings and consultations have been postponed as well. People have been divided within the policy community as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Those who would say there are pros include Bob Einhorn, who suggested that the delay has created a reprieve to advance discussions before the meeting. And certainly there has been, there have been a lot of discussions going on, but there hasn't necessarily been convergence on key themes like risk reduction. And so this might buy us a little bit more time to decide what risk reduction is and what's acceptable language if we are to try and aim for an agreed final outcome document. The other argument that's sometimes being used to say this is a good thing is that expectations were already low, and that the pandemic may now be a kind of diplomatic excuse if nothing much is achieved. But of course, on the other side, on the cons, what we actually wanted is progress and not excuses. So I'm not sure, for me, that really stands up. That's a sort of narrow diplomatic way of looking at it. I think one of the more worrying things is that the pandemic may limit the ability of civil society to participate fully in the review conference. Usually civil society is very active, hosting side events, sharing materials, and generally being a channel of communication among states, between civil society and states, and so on. As has happened in, I think it was the Human Rights Council, they've pressed ahead with a meeting at the official level, but they've limited side events and non-governmental representation. And it's quite possible that that will happen again for the RevCon, with all the kind of implications that that would have for the sorts of meetings that NGOs are planning at the moment, like ours. Other multilateral meetings include the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament approach, which the US has been pushing. That had a meeting in April that was postponed. The IPNDV has been postponed. Conference on Disarmament has gone partially virtual, and that's a bit of a shame because what the chairs have managed to do this year was coordinate their chairing across 6 different chairs to try and advance progress, and this has put something of a spanner in the works. And some of this matters more than others. You know, some of this is a long-term game anyway, but the worry is that the international security environment is not improving on its own, and it needs interventions now. And in the time that we have, it may get a lot worse before we're able to intervene at both the official and the non-governmental level. To talk a little bit about the NGO sector, everything I've said about multilateral regimes affects NGOs like BASIC and British Pugwash. Obviously, travel's been halted. The reports that we'd hoped to launch at the RevCon in April and May will have to have different kinds of launches. Risk reduction meetings that we were hoping to host in different parts of the world will either go virtual or they'll be postponed until next year when travel lifts, whichever is sooner. And I think particularly what the NGOs are thinking about as ever, but now more than ever, is the uncertain funding environment they find themselves in. This has been particularly keenly felt in the UK because the Counter-Proliferation and Arms Control Centre, which is a joint unit within the UK government which deals with nuclear weapons, which oversees the funding to the non-governmental sector, quite suddenly called a halt to its funding decisions as people within that department were rotated onto the COVID-19 response. So that put a bit of it was a jarring moment, I suppose, when it came to looking at BASIC's budget. and it's still unclear whether that money will kind of come through later in the year, or this is something that we'll actually just have to pick up next year. For us, so far, this year's been okay, but the global recession that's looming is obviously worrying, particularly given that foundations and trusts are very often linked to the stock market. So far, it seems like they are kind of recognizing that they can't just retract everything. And it may be that, particularly in the case of US funding, the fall in the amount of money being pledged in dollars may be offset to some extent if the US dollar continues to decline as it is. But that will also depend a little bit on how the pound fares. And the kind of cold but unfortunate truth is that some NGOs probably will go bust in the sector. And that raises all sorts of concerns about a hollowing out of non-governmental space. In terms of sort of our ways of working, Basic put together a COVID-19 strategy at the beginning of March to give us some guiding principles for how we're going to weather the next 6 months to a year, for example. And we organized it around 3 slightly corporate buzzwords, which were adapt, so focusing on the work we can do. So that includes more research and the move to virtual meetings. Innovate, which is about us sort of reimagining what we can offer the community and communicate how we can communicate our value in different ways. And we thought also under the sort of innovate heading about how we can strengthen ourselves from the inside. So really returning to the question of what our mission, vision, values are as an organization, what kind of networks we have and what kind of networks we want. We are reforming our human resources with a whole suite of new policies, working with some pro bono lawyers who don't have much to do. And we've been completely overhauling sort of our financial systems as well. So we've tried to see this moment as an opportunity to get the house in order, in a sense. And then the third principle was around economizing and trying to reduce costs wherever we can, essentially storing up our resource for next year, when I think the recession is going to probably hit all of the NGO sector a little bit harder. The other challenge within the NGO sector is going to be, I think, particularly for young and emerging leaders in this field, it's going to be challenging to, there will be fewer jobs. So it's going to be challenging to get new contracts or retain contracts or convert internships into jobs. And we may see a sort of dip, a demographic dip for a couple of years in terms of who is attracted to this field and how long they stay in it. But as I'll say at the end, I think there are also opportunities for the NGO sector. Before I say that, just a quick couple of words on the academic sector. As I'm sure some of you will know, working in universities, universities are under enormous budgetary pressures, particularly those universities that are reliant on foreign intake. Probably in the UK in the regions of tens or hundreds of millions of pounds. And in some cases, going bust as well. I've already heard reports of one university that might be going that way. It also means that academics who might have spent time on research and collaborations with government or with the NGO sector will probably have to spend more time teaching, or they may be made redundant as universities cut staff costs. And finally, there may be course cuts. So again, I've heard a rumor, unsubstantiated, so I won't name it, but that there is a major international relations related course in the UK that's going to be cut, which would be a huge loss to the community if that happens. So that's my sort of slightly doom and gloom 4/5 of my talk. And I thought now I want to leave you on a slightly happier or more optimistic note anyway, because I think what COVID-19 also does, and we're just starting to see the green shoots of this discourse emerge, is it gives us an opportunity to reconceptualize security. I think we're seeing within the policy community, and that includes within government, a kind of philosophical soul searching about what we're trying to protect when we talk about security and where weapons are useful and cease to be useful. That's a debate that's been going on within international relations debates for some time. So it's been framed around international security, national security, and human security. and the environment comes in there as well. But I think we're starting to see that come out of academia and into the policy space in a meaningful way now, and that's quite exciting. That's being prompted not only by COVID-19, which looks at health as a security issue, but also the unignorable juggernaut of climate change. And more recently, I think the BLM protests have brought this to the fore in terms of, in America, no matter how many nuclear weapons you have, if the individual lives of Black people are under daily threat, then there are budgetary opportunity costs that need to be looked at. My colleague Marina Favaro has written an article on the Outrider Foundation, which I would highly recommend you read, which frames, which talks about how governments have framed their COVID-19 responses as war. So you see all sorts of martial rhetoric being used in the fight against COVID-19, frontline workers, that sort of thing. And it's an interesting double-edged sword for governments, because on the one hand, it can rally the masses. In the UK, we know how World War II imagery and Churchill can be invoked in times of national crisis to remind us how it's done. But it also, if indeed COVID-19 is a war, then it allows us to put two kinds of security side by side and say, okay, well, which one's killing more? Which one do we want to prioritize as a matter of policy? So I would say that recent events, including COVID-19, have created the greatest opportunity in a generation to make seismic shifts in how we conceive of security and to make the case to cut military budgets and reduce militarization. We're seeing that in the US in the language of rethinking national security, and myself and others in the community are following that with some interest and hoping that it doesn't get kind of co-opted by the mainstream elite and turned into just another rebranding, repackaging of the same old story. That debate is taking form in the sort of missiles versus medical masks debate. If you can spend X amount on a missile, why can't you spend the same amount on many more pieces of personal protective equipment? The feminist foreign policy angle is growing in STEAM, and I would encourage you to look into the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, who offer a fantastic internship and mentorship opportunities, and who are really starting to outline what a feminist foreign policy in the UK and elsewhere could look like. The UK is now postponed, but is still conducting its integrated review, which tries to bring together defence, security, international development, and foreign policy under a single document. You might have seen in the newspapers today that DFID and the FCO are going to be merged. And in our consultations with government so far, they've asked us explicitly to try and consider how COVID-19 and broader understandings of security could make an appearance in that final document when it does finally get written. And of course, all of this is only going to have any impact if there are some sort of budgetary implications that governments have to, governments decide to change budgets. In the US, COVID-19 is estimated to add trillions of dollars to the federal deficit. So it will be harder to justify excessive spending on nuclear weapons programs, even in a US context, when there are so many other security issues, human security issues that need dealing with. So I would say, and I would kind of encourage everybody on the call today, that now is the time to permanently move away from a narrow vision of security and demand a holistic approach in all of your work going forwards. I think international security and national security can seem like very alluring concepts, and it's important that we don't kind of buy into that allure too much. Be broad and force yourself to sort of think, even if it's uncomfortable, about the way these often siloed debates connect together. So I hope that was a useful interview. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks, Sebastian. You got a thumbs up from Andrew there. So before getting into audience questions, I just have two questions, if that's okay. Things that I was thinking about as you were speaking. So firstly, I know a lot of basics work is grounded in the idea of trust building. I was wondering if you could comment on how you think reduced in-person diplomatic meetings might affect trust building in the nuclear space. And then kind of relatedly, but a different angle to the same issue, do you think there might be any positive effects from increased digital activity by actors involved in the non-proliferation and disarmament space?
Great. Yeah, I think two really good questions. On the first, yes, I mean, I've got a long-term collaboration with Professor Nicholas Wheeler at the Institute for Conflict Cooperation and Security at the University of Birmingham. Nick wrote one of the books on trust, which came out in 2017, called Trusting Enemies, which I would highly recommend everybody read. It's got a great image of an acrobat at the moment that they're being thrown to be caught by another acrobat on the front cover. It's a lovely image of trust. And Nick's proposal, the finding of that book, is that you can do things through interpersonal meetings that you can't do in any other way. And actually, in the case studies he uses, which include Nixon in China and the meeting of Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik in 1985, it was those interpersonal meetings amongst the top level heads of state that really were the enablers of sort of longer term paradigm shifts in the relationships between those two states. I think it remains to be seen quite how different Zoom is going to be. We all know that going to conferences, there are two purposes for going to conferences. One is to actually attend the talk, and the other one is to go and have a drink in the bar or a coffee in the sidelines. And actually it's in those moments we meet the people who often would go on to become our collaborators and so forth. And a lot of nuclear diplomacy has taken place in bars late at night. You can't necessarily do that easily over Zoom, as you can imagine. Having a drink on your own while in a virtual side room just doesn't quite have the same feel. So it's an open question. I think it's something that actually needs to be researched, and will probably have to be researched in terms of perceptions. From my own experience so far, I actually feel more connected to other people in the space, which is a strange thing. But actually the time that not commuting, not moving between meetings and so on has opened up has enabled me to have far more conversations over Zoom and that sort of thing. And it just somehow feels a little bit more targeted. There may be a difference in if you've met the person before. Let's say you've already sort of got that interpersonal trust, you've got that oxytocin rush, which is what they say trust is sort of founded on at the neuroscientific level. And maybe it's more easily activated if you've met them before and you see their face over a video conference. But so far, at least in terms of those people who are sort of quote unquote on the same side, I haven't had any major issues. I'm hoping that later in the year, some of the work that we were hoping to do with the UK government will start to pick up, and that will involve actors who are in an active, distrusting relationship with each other. So it'll be really interesting to see how video teleconferencing sort of mediates that relationship in probably positive and negative ways. So I think, in answer to your question, it's hard to know exactly without doing some sort of large-scale study, but my personal experience so far has been relatively positive. And I think if it does enable us to connect up a bit more, as well as reduce the amount of travel we do, which is good for our mental health and good for the environment, I think that is a good thing.
That's great, thanks, Sebastian. And so we have our first question in the chat box, which I'll read out shortly. Just as a reminder, we are taking questions via the chat or via video link. If you'd like to speak your question over video, you can raise your hand or wave using the reaction at the bottom. Otherwise, feel free to put it in the chat box as well. So the first audience question is from Richard Guthrie, who asks, If the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference is convened for its full length in 2021, what are the implications for the meetings of other regimes? 2021 is scheduled to also contain the 6th Review Conference for the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW, and the 9th Review Conference for the Biological Weapons Convention, the BWC. As many countries have small non-proliferation and disarmament departments that cover all of these topics, some of these departments may not have funds to support their normal level of representation at all of the international meetings. Will this have implications for policy developments?
Great. Thank you, Richard. Nice to hear from you. I mean, you're far more expert on the ins and outs of the BWC, and I suspect probably the CCW as well, than I am. I think what I would say is that when I started in my career in this field, it was really in the midst of the TPNW negotiations. And one of the things, rightly or wrongly, that was being raised over and over again by sort of smaller states that had smaller staffing levels, maybe one member of staff who took care of nuclear, chemical, biological, and other weapons, was that they couldn't, they just didn't have the bandwidth to represent at the same level for all of those. So they would have to start making choices. That bandwidth is both relevant in terms of sort of mental bandwidth of those people, but also their ability to be physically present at multiple meetings, to travel and have any sort of semblance of a work-life balance. So, you know, local staff were sent in the place of maybe the desk officer, and states were claimed, you know, reported that they had to make kind of policy choices that they wouldn't necessarily have wanted to make. That said, if you speak to some of the states that were leading the TPNW effort, and thinking back to some of the conversations I had among the 6 that were really leading it, which included Brazil and Ireland, it was felt that you have to sometimes make sacrifices like that. You know, some things, it's not that they're more important, but actually that you can't get a good run at things if you're always spreading yourself thinly like butter. In the occasional year, you put a bit more of effort into one, and then maybe you try and make up the difference somewhere else. So I can't sort of speak for the other 2 conventions that you've mentioned. I think certainly next year is going to be a very important year for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. It's been under strain for some time. The risks do seem to be mounting. The faith in a step-by-step approach to disarmament does seem to be waning. Proliferation risks do seem to be expanding. I could go on. And perhaps it's quite fortunate that it is hoped to take place in January, because if it does, it will allow us to kind of get that out of the way. And then hopefully states can sort of pull their socks up and just try to prepare as best they can for the next meetings. But all of which is to say that biological weapons, certain conventional weapons, are no less important than nuclear weapons. It's just a reality that we're all having to deal with as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
That was great. Thanks, Sebastian. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? So you can either submit via the chat box or wave your hand and I can call on you. Okay, it seems we're okay for the moment. I have one more question, if that's okay, Seb. So I was wondering if what you thought about how issues around transparency and visibility of nuclear disarmament diplomacy might be affected because of the move to potentially diplomatic meetings being held digitally. Do you think this has the potential to make them more visible? So there is maybe the issue of in-person meetings being more restricted in terms of access to civil society because of the pandemic. But if it is kind of a shift digitally, do you think that might have some broader positive impacts?
Interesting question. One of the things that's really surprised me on Twitter because I'm a relentless Twitter follower, is quite how many people are taking screenshots of their Zoom calls and then posting them onto Twitter. And I wonder in each of those cases whether they've actually asked everybody whether they can do that, or if that's just a sort of, it's been taken as an unspoken norm that you can kind of share the faces, if not the substance of the conversations, the sort of digital Chatham House rule. I don't know is the honest answer. I think what I have noticed is that meetings that would have been limited in their participation because of being in person and you know, the costs of the reception or the room capacity or whatever it is, means that you have to put a limit on the number of people that come to those meetings, are of course going online if they do go ahead. And there's no obvious limit online unless you're trying to have a kind of closed door round table. And also that when things go online, there's a sort of there's a, I don't want to say imperative, but there's more of a reason for organizations to make them free and open to the public, which is not necessarily the case if you have to be a Chatham House member or whatever it is. I suspect it will go in both directions. There'll be a kind of democratization of the space to some extent in terms of the participation of the general interested public in these issues. I can't see necessarily why having a private virtual meeting is any less transparent than having a private in-person meeting. So yeah, no, actually, I mean, revising what I've just said, I think probably it'll create more transparency in the regime, but it's hard to know at this point. And again, we'll probably have to look back a little bit and decide in the light of retrospect.
That was great, thank you. So we have 2 audience questions now from the chat. So Frederick Marcus has asked, given that President Trump is withdrawing from all disarmament treaties, how can one go forward? Will not all small countries decide they are now on their own for their own defense? And then I'll group with that another question that we have from Charaz Trenov, who asks, you mentioned the potential for the pandemic to pose a disruption to current nuclear strike capabilities, especially when it comes to seaborne submarine launched ballistic missiles. Do you believe this will spur future development of increasingly automated nuclear delivery platforms to avoid the risk of any future outbreaks causing disruptions again? So.
Great. Well, thank you both. To Frederick's question first. So I would correct it slightly insofar as President Trump is withdrawing from arms control treaties rather than disarmament treaties, which are seen by some as a step in the direction of disarmament, but by many sort of on the deterrence side, not as steps towards disarmament, and they would fight back at that to some extent. How can one go forward? It's the question we are all asking ourselves every day. I mean, I think the policy community has really revealed its own myopia in the last sort of 4 years of Trump's administration. I don't think anybody anticipated anything like this level of withdrawal. And I hope it doesn't need to be said that there's no obvious reason for a lot of these withdrawals. Certainly the JCPOA being the obvious one. It took 12 years to negotiate and is being torn apart without any kind of viable replacement. And small compliance errors or issues, particularly I think in relation to the Open Skies Treaty, are doing far more harm than they are good. It's difficult for NGOs outside the US and Russia, I think, to have an impact on these things because our principal impact is on our own governments who are not party to these treaties. So they can, if you have enough impact, they can represent at the official level, the ministerial level, and try to suggest politely that these states sort of maintain the bilateral treaties that they've negotiated. And we can try to mediate to some extent. but we cannot directly impact those treaties. I'm not sure all small countries will necessarily decide they're on their own, but I think the trend is in that direction. The problem is that we're now entering a situation where we have sort of a return to some very large, powerful players that are not afraid to throw their weight around in the way the kind of post-war period didn't witness. In sort of classical IR speak, the argument would be that actually smaller countries would band together to try and offset and balance that sort of larger power. I think in the sort of NATO context, that's the trend we're seeing. Outside of the NATO context, we are seeing a return, well, and including inside the NATO context, we're seeing a return to arms racing because of the distrust. And I would root it back to distrust at the end of the day. So we try to work at that level. If you have trust, then the incentives to build arms and try and race and to get paranoid about one's own security are reduced. But it's difficult. Even European states are working at the sidelines of these issues, and NGOs within European states are on the sidelines of those states. So I wish I had a better, a magic wand type answer, but I don't. We just try to do our best to come up with good ideas and then communicate them in a compelling story and frame them in ways that are better than the alternative or the status quo. Beyond that, we don't have forms of power that we can draw upon to do any better than that. To Taras's question, thank you. Just rereading it. Yeah, interesting. So some of the work I did with British Pugwash right at the beginning of my involvement was around the use of robotics and other emerging technologies in the undersea space. And principally, I was looking at how automated systems could be used in the future to track submarines and potentially give away their location. What has come to light in the last couple of years, I think it was President Putin's speech at the beginning of February 2018, was that the Russian Federation has developed an automated system that's capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. It's essentially a nuclear torpedo called Poseidon or Canyon 6. The idea of this torpedo is that it could be a sort of last resort type weapon. It would be impossible to find, and it could make its own way from sort of the waters of Russia to the east coast of America, where it could detonate and cause a sort of radioactive tsunami that would flood east coast cities. So that's the way it's been talked about. There have been talks about automated bomber missions as well. Obviously, in a sense, sorry, there was an article in War on the Rocks, which received a lot of negative attention, thankfully, about sort of automating some of the command and control of the US command and control system. And those were debates that were had in the 1980s and are now sort of rearing their heads again, unfortunately, because people like to see exciting technologies and think about ways they can be stuck together. All of the reasons that people were deterred from automating systems in the 1980s, and if anyone's seen the film War Games, you'll be familiar with this, is the risk of technological error. So do we really want to be entrusting even a very smart computer with the lives of millions, hundreds of millions of people? The answer is, in my view, no. There are risks on both sides, but there is also human judgment on one side, which can step in and be something like a circuit breaker in ways that automated systems can't, and which may malfunction in ways that we don't anticipate. But going a level down, so even if the human sort of was in the loop, decided to make the launch order. Will we see a move towards more automated systems that don't rely on humans? Yes, I think we probably will. At the moment, the nuclear torpedo I mentioned has been treated as an exotic technology that's unique to Russia. And I think it's been framed in quite negative terms. But I don't think we should rule out the possibility by any stretch that we'll start to see these technologies emerge in China and the US and probably elsewhere as well. There is a narrow nuclear strategic reason why you might want to have a technology like this, at least in your arsenal. Do I think we will move to fully automated submarines and so forth? Not for a very long time, not before governments feel extremely confident in the ability of automated systems to work as they're supposed to be able to deliver what they're intended to deliver, when and how they're wanted to deliver them. So in a sense, I'm hopeful that we can keep humans in the loop for as long as possible, if not indefinitely, and that actually we may have made more substantial reductions or eliminations to nuclear forces worldwide before we get to a point where we're considering fully automated nuclear systems versus fully automated nuclear system.
That was great. Thank you, Sebastian. I think we have about 5 minutes left before 6 o'clock. So would you mind answering one last question that's come in from Andrew and Richard? They're quite similar, so I think they could be grouped.
Sure.
So Andrew asks, do you have a sense of how the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference might be different if Trump loses the election in November? And then Richard has asked, so are there any implications of the January dates for the review conference and the US political calendar? If there were to be a change of US president, the swearing in would be during the proposed dates of the NPT review conference. Wouldn't that give the US an excuse to say they couldn't agree to anything significant at the NPT as the new administration was still formulating its policies?
Yeah, both good questions. You know, as Frederick has pointed out, President Trump doesn't seem to have treated any of the treaties that the US has signed up to as sacred. And there is I think a real, though often unspoken fear at the moment in the policy community, perhaps in part because nobody wants to give him any ideas, that the US could also pull out of the NPT. It's not something that we can rule out. Alternatively, President Trump might want to use the NPT RevCon as a platform. It's not unheard of for ministers and other high-ranking officials to go and to speak, and it could be enormously disruptive. So depending on the outcome of the election, I think it will be very different. The big thing that's coming up straight after the review conference is the expiry of New START, which is the arms control treaty that limits US and Russian strategic nuclear forces. It's the last bilateral arms control treaty between those two countries. And the hope is that it can be extended for another 5 years to allow for a renegotiation of sort of the follow-on treaty, which is how these things have progressed over various life cycles. There was a recent study by a group of Russians that looked into how much time would be needed before a decision on New START could be made. So what's the latest point, in other words, that they could agree to extend it and then get it through the domestic legislatures? I think the answer was 45 days. Do correct me if anybody remembers that differently. But that will mean that sort of the latest point will come sometime in the middle of the review conference. And you could see a reason why someone might want to announce that at the review conference. you could also see them sort of withholding that to try and leverage other outcomes at the RevCon. So it's a very contentious time. People have been asking for years for New START to be extended as soon as possible, just have the agreement and get on with it. But it's so far the United States has been holding firm to this idea of trilateral arms control, so bringing China into the US-Russia arms control regime for the first time. If, for what it's worth, I think that has almost zero chances of success, at least in the way that it's been attempted. You know, it may be that the Trump administration knows that and is actually just trying to get some kind of concessions out of Russia, and it's using this trilateral arms control agenda as an excuse. Or it may be that it really has no intention of extending New START. Either way, the effect of that decision will have ripples for the review conference, and I think that's probably the one to watch for, in a sense. If Biden wins in November, I suspect it would be one of the first things sort of they would do on day one of the new administration, which will come in too late, but there would be more assuredness within the RevCon community that arms control, at least at the strategic level, will be preserved and probably has a positive future in the coming few years.
That was great. Thank you, Sebastian. So I think we're unfortunately at 6 o'clock now, so that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much for speaking. I personally found that really interesting, and I think we can tell from the audience questions that you've really kind of inspired a lot of thinking amongst us, especially around looking at new ways of thinking about security. And I can see some thumbs up coming through the Zoom chat as well, which is always a good sign. So as I said at the beginning, this is the first in a series of webinars that Pugwash UK is looking to run. So please keep an eye out for our next webinar, which we should be publicizing shortly. And thank you again to Sebastian from BASIC for talking to us today. Do follow them on social media. They do a lot of really interesting work. And also thank you to Andrew and Jean for helping with the organization today. And thank you as well to the audience for coming along.
Thank you, Neve, and British Pugwash for having me. It's been a pleasure.